Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first webinar that we have run so far in 2021. We do have a series planned through till April, and others I'm sure will come after that, so do look out for the other ones as well. Very happy to have you all here with us today, and I'm sure there may be a couple of others who are going to join us. I know how back-to-back things can be in these days of online meetings and so on, so don't be surprised if we get some others popping in. So I'm going to ask that you keep your videos off if you wouldn't mind throughout this session, and that we use the chat function for comments and anything that you'd like to offer into the session, and I'll be looking out for those and trying to bring those in. And certainly, inviting some comments as we go along, but we're going to keep the videos off if that's okay. Be aware that we're recording this session, so if you are going to contribute, then just be mindful of the fact that we will be recording it so that we can share it further and wider with those who might be interested. So I think that's all that I need to say by way of housekeeping and our sort of protocols for this session. We'll run for about between 45 minutes and an hour. We'll definitely be done by 11 o'clock UK time. So once again, if I can extend a huge welcome to everybody, and let's take some time now to have a think about systems leadership and what that's got to do with dance and what we can learn from dancing, whether we are practitioners of dance or not. Just to say, I think I know most people who are on the call today, but just to reintroduce myself and the organisation. My name's Lorraine Flower. I'm the Managing Director of Azure, and we're a conscious leadership consultancy, organisational development consultancy. We certainly have a deep belief and commitment to helping leaders to raise their awareness beyond the perhaps traditional level in which they often engage with their organisations. And so we call that consciousness, but that expands into realms that are perhaps a little beyond just the physical and the intellectual. So we try to bring a broader, deeper sense of the function of leadership, the practice of leadership, but also some of the responsibilities and accountabilities that go with that, and how that can then impact the organisation, but also positioning the organisation within today's world. So we're very committed to helping our clients and people generally to really thrive in the world in which we're living today, but also to help change and shape that world for the future. And systems leadership is a fantastic lens through which to be able to do that. So dance, I don't know about you, but isn't necessarily a topic that we would associate with the world of leadership or business. Having had the privilege of learning, well, maybe trying to learn a range of ballroom and Latin dances some couple of years ago, which was an absolute joy. I certainly came into pretty close contact with my understanding of rhythm and freedom and flow, particularly in the Latin dances, because there's a greater demand for flexibility, for being really in tune with your partner, and taking off some of the shackles that inhibit us in our movement and in our relationship with not just one other that might be our partner, but many others when we're on the dance floor. So dance calls forth from us passion, an ability to build strong relationships, not in necessarily just the conventional sense, but in a deeply intuitive sense, to be able to bring that beauty that sits within the dance practice out. We have to be in resonance with our partners and with the group that we're working with, and that requires a sort of intuitive rapport. So we're getting into something that it goes beyond words, even though we may use words to define and design that dance activity. So we're engaging ourselves in a symbiotic relationship with rhythm, with music. We get into more alignment, more of a flowing space, and it demands of us that we're fully aware. We have to be aware of ourselves, we have to be aware of others, and we have to be aware of our environment. And so we're operating with multiple levels of awareness and consciousness. And we have to be able to anticipate, perhaps think several moves ahead. Obviously, as we practice more, we have less thinking to do and more being. So dance is also an expression of beingness, of how we actually bring ourselves out into expression without having to think and plan every step and every stage. It's a mindset as much as it is a practice. And all of these words that I've used to describe dance are words that we can apply in the systems leadership space. So as we start to get underneath and think a little bit more about what is this system and what is our role within the system, we can hold that analogy of dance perhaps in our minds as we go through. And it is an approach that needs a lot of practice, just as dance does. And it requires us to have some courage to really shift not only our own attitudes and mindsets, but to put our heads above the parapet and invite others in our organization into that space also. And here we'll come up against some of the challenges or the perceived barriers that exist in trying to bring this type of thinking, this type of leadership, this type of way of functioning, particularly in change and transformation, but as a more general practice. There are a number of things that we have to confront along that journey, and we'll touch into some of those. I think this quote is very helpful. Donella Meadows is someone who has worked quite significantly in the systems leadership space, has done a lot of thinking and work in this space. And she brings forward some useful analogies, I think, here for us to also connect in with, having offered you the dance one. But she describes this as a need for us to recognize that we have to move beyond control. And herein, just right out of the door, we confront something that is so fundamental in organizational terms, that need for control, that sense of wanting to be in charge of all aspects of the system and how the system is working, our organization, for all sorts of reasons. And we'll come on to that a little bit more. But so one of the first things we have to come into when we're thinking about systems and systems leadership is to recognize that we can't control systems, and she argues we can't figure them out. But what we can do is come into relationship with them, come into relationship with those systems. And she's drawn her analogies here from some of the kind of perhaps more extreme sports in terms of whitewater kayaking and skiing, but also in some of the softer and gentler aspects of gardening and music. So as we do those practices, as we do those things in everyday life, we do them best when we are in the moment, actually being in the situation. Yes, we have to do a lot of practice and skills development to get there, but when we release ourselves into the practice, then we have a completely different experience of it. She argues that there's some things that we need to be able to bring into that, which is this staying wide awake, awareness, consciousness, being able to bring our attention both to the detail but also to the bigger picture, to really commit ourselves in that passion again, participate flat out, and be in relationship with the system and responsive to it, so we can't get into that stuck, static place. And of course, we believe, she certainly was arguing, that these are principles, these are ways of being that are relevant to the workplace and to leadership. So why is systems thinking relevant, of value to us today? Peter Senge is one of the kind of godfathers, I guess we might use that term, of systems thinking and change within a systems dynamic. And his book, The Fifth Discipline, from which this quote is taken, goes back over 20 years. Not a huge amount of time when you think about organizational culture and change, and yet very relevant for a lot of what we see in our world here today. And in bringing ourselves into the systems thinking space, we have to start to be able to think about wholes. In other words, think more holistically, seeing things in a much broader and more total is not even the right word, because actually in reality the system extends beyond our ability to hold it all, but to be able to think much more in that holistic way. And it's also about being able to see the interdependencies and the interrelationships within the system. And this is something that we often forget. We fall foul of it many times in an organizational space. We pull a lever here, we make a decision there, we take an action somewhere else, but we don't necessarily think about the consequential effects of that. And we're going to talk about cause and effect in this as well. Certainly our world today, we know, is incredibly complex, and just seems to becoming more and more complex, with our inability at times, it seems, to hold all the things that we need to hold. And here again, this is where we come into a letting go process. Systems thinking invites us to lean into that not knowing and to let go more. And so our ability to work with this complexity, to keep pace with it, and to move into what feels like an ever accelerating change, notwithstanding this stasis that we find ourselves in with the COVID pandemic. Nevertheless, there is still a sense of energetic speed and activity, and more and more complex issues being revealed as we think about, on a broader global humankind platform, of the number of things that we have ahead of us to address, some fairly substantial challenges, not least of which climate change, injustices, and issues around equality, fairness, and so on. So the size of our challenge is massive. And Peter Senge argues, and I for one support this, that we really need to be coming into this space of systems thinking and systems leadership if we're to stand a chance of being effective. Another godfather again and activist in this area is Otto Scharmer, and his work in Theory U, also with Peter Senge, and his ULab work has really set about fostering dialogues across complex social systems. So through the mass online communities that he's been able to cultivate and develop through his position at MIT, he's been able to start to help people find other people in their locality, in their communities, that are actually starting to practice, to experiment, to think about how they can create dialogues across the social system. And if we can do it on that level, for sure we can do it in the organizational space. But as I said, it's a potentially a bit of an uphill journey that we have on our hands, and it requires a lot of courage and a lot of commitment on the part of those who are perhaps seeing that opportunity. So if we think about where we are now, we can see that actually we're very much in a space that the military coined as VUCA. And this is a phrase, an acronym that's been around for quite some time, but it is definitely relevant to not just the military world, but to our world in general. And VUCA, which most of you will be aware of, really speaks to a lot of what we're experiencing now in terms of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and really not having clarity, so that ambiguity and our inability to perhaps work out the right ways forward, even on sometimes some very local decisions. And this perhaps also juxtapositions with another acronym we could put forward, which is LAMO, which is this interplay between the environment that we're in, but also the mindset and the mentality that we tend to still be operating with, which is very linear. So a tendency to think in fairly simplistic ways, particularly when we think organizationally and we think about that desire to bring things into a simple solution. And not that there's anything wrong with simplicity, but the danger is that we think everything has to be resolved in that A to B simplistic way. We also tend to be very anthropocentric, which means that we tend to see the world only from our perspective. And as a humanity, we are certainly seeing the impacts of that as we've, not to use too strong a word, raped and pillaged our planet in many ways, because we've felt that we were really the masters of everything. And the planet has very clearly shown us that we can't control everything, and that a lot of the natural disasters that we're experiencing show us the power of the environment within which we are operating. So we have to get ourselves out from that thinking we're the center of the world and seeing things in a more systemic way. We also have quite a mechanistic attitude and mindset, and so we tend to think the world functions like a machine, and we bring that into our organizations. That production mentality, those of you who've been with us before will have heard me speak about that, but that tendency to want to see things in a very mechanized, productionized way, where there's that control, and in this last word, ordered, the sense that things can be controlled in a very static and linear way, and that they operate in a preordained set of hierarchies. This is the thinking that we have to challenge within ourselves, and to expand it out into something that is much more systems focused. And we can do that perhaps by thinking a little bit more about what is it that this systems approach, this systems thinking invites us into when we're trying to see the system. And offering here some work by a lady called Vanessa Sayers, who has put a compare and contrast between what she calls a more Newtonian approach to in comparison to a more systems approach. And as we sort of expand our thinking further, it's not to say that the Newtonian approach is bad and systems is good. It's not what we're setting up here, but it is about recognizing that we can't put all of our eggs in the Newtonian basket. And typically as organizations, that is what we've tended to do. And as leaders, it's what we've tended to do. That actually we've got to start to create much more understanding and practice in this space of systems, and moving into a recognition of the need to be influential, the need to embrace diversity, thankfully very much on the agenda today in organizations, obviously still a long way to go with that in real terms, that we can see that things have multiple causes, and that these tend to come round and compound on each other, and therefore we have to be able to think in a much broader way. That we start to bring in both and thinking rather than either or thinking. Again, we tend to, in that simplistic mindset, want to be able to take things out of the equation and reduce it down to something, whereas maybe we have to allow for the fact that it's both and we'll again talk a little bit more about that as we go. And I think the challenge with the systems environment and the systems thinking approach is that it can evoke fear and uncertainty, because it can seem to lack boundaries. It can seem to lack those safety rails that we tend to rely on in life generally and in organizations. And we're creatures of habit. We're creatures of, even though sometimes we'll complain, as we are doing now, about nothing in our lives is changing. It's all very similar. One day looks like the next in COVID world. But in reality, still deep down in our psyche is this preference for some level of certainty, of safety, of predictability, if you will. And yet, as we're seeing in real time, actually that's not the reality of the world we live in. And it's not actually, never has been, but we're getting to see that perhaps more up close and personal in these times. So when we start to get into that systems leadership, systems thinking approach, we have to be prepared to disturb things a little bit. We have to be prepared to bring some challenge into the equation. It is about movement. It is about introducing some ambiguity, some difference, to create some space for new ideas to come forward. Here we might think, which is not so much a dance movement, although I guess there is a little bit of dance that can be done to it, but if we think about jazz and improvisation, there is something where there's a kind of different level of movement that can go on, and an ability to each person having that supreme skill, as most jazz musicians do have, but when they come together in a group formation, they are able to jam with each other, to improvise, to take the lead, to shift the lead, to move about. That disturbance produces a whole different sound. Maybe not everybody's choice or preference, but it produces a different rhythm, a different flow that has a lot of movement in it, a lot of motion in it. So we have to be prepared to disturb. We have to be prepared to bring something new in. And if we think about the natural world, rivers are a great example where, if something gets in the way, they find a workaround. They find a way of breaking up the bit of land they can get to and finding a new pathway. They don't allow themselves to become stuck in that space. So being prepared to move into some different ways of thinking is a fundamental underpinning of systems leadership and systems thinking. So if we just kind of bring together some of those things so far, we're really looking at our relationship with control. I think when we look at organizational life, we want to be able to control a lot of things. And of course, control has a lot of value in some areas in terms of being able to monitor, see our performance, measure, do all of those sorts of things. But in reality, we're not as in control as we like to pretend we are. And so one of the things that systems leadership challenges is our ability to really confront that and confront this need for control and move into perhaps a different expression of control, which is much more relational, is much more in this dance mode where we're moving with and flowing with and adjusting to. And again, from an organizational point of view, thinking in this more expansive way means that we have to stop trying to just put everything into neat boxes. We have to be prepared to get a little bit messy, a little bit untidy, a little bit less linear. And we also need to recognize that it requires some different mindsets and different aptitudes and skills and ways of working. So as we might have said from the beginning, we need to learn to dance, learn how to move in a different way. And this quote from Socrates, I think, is quite helpful, because systems leadership often comes into its own when we're starting to think about change, when we're starting to think about some level of transformation. And that's not transformation in the big programmatic, set piece sense, but transformation that takes place over time. And this invitation to not kind of keep battling with the old, but to focus on building the new, I think is quite an interesting one, because it brings in a much more possibility focused way of thinking and looking at things. It puts us less into direct conflict with the existing culture, the existing practices, and starts to invite people into a space that is much more open and much more, has many more possibilities and much more potential within it. And so inviting people into a vision of the new is our possibility. And interestingly, at this time in organizational life and history, and obviously world history, we have that opportunity. You know, this huge pause that we've been in, even though we've been keeping businesses going and having to address many of the challenges that COVID has presented, it also has potentially, if we've been prepared to take it, provided an opportunity to do some deeper thinking and think about what is the new that we are wanting to create in our organizations. How do we want to take those organizations into their next generation, not attached to and fixed by what has gone before, but really opening up into new possibilities. And how do we put out that call to participate in that and get people involved in that potential? The risk is that we think about doing these things, we can see the potential for them, but we get defeated by the size of the challenge. So we do have to start to build those new skills, or to tap into our skills and qualities around courage, but also around influencing and around changing the dialogue, changing the nature of the conversation that goes on in organizations, and move it into a completely new space of possibilities. Also important in this whole systems leadership space, inevitably, is our ability to see the system. The ability to see that system and its interrelationships, its interconnection points, the degree to which we are able to see beyond just the physical, the obvious. So people, structures, desks, office spaces, you know, all of those physical symbols and realities that we live with. And again, some of those have been deconstructed, dismantled in this period of COVID. A lot of the mental interconnections that we see, which are those thought forms, those ideas, those practices that have become established, they've become folklore, they've become the way we do things around here. We need to be able to see those, because if we're going to create new thought forms, create new ways of doing things, we have to have an awareness of what's in the system already. What are the beliefs that we hold? How well have our values served us? What actually goes on in the in-between parts of our system, which is where we then tap into some of the more emotional and energetic layers of our system, because we have to use our sensing to be able to tap into the system, not just seeing it on its physical level or its intellectual level or its mental level, but actually starting to see it as a field of emotion, a field of energy, a field of movement. Again, back to the dance. So we've got to be able to bring our whole being in when we're seeing the system. We've got to feel it, be it, live it, embody it, as it were. And then we move from that space. We move from that deeper sense of relationship with the system. This piece of work is something that was done by a range, a cross-section of pioneers in the system space, and some public sector, academics, a whole range of people. And they set out to think about what the lexicon is. What are the key words that are relevant to this new space, this system space? And what is it that will allow us to start to bring new ways of thinking, a new mindset into play? And I've put all of those on the left-hand side that they came up with, and it's a really exciting and positive piece of work. Goes back now about 5 years or so, 6 years. But I've pulled out some specifics, perhaps that resonate, I think, in the current space. This word destroy, we've talked about disturbing, but clearly in terms of the old, there is a certain amount of dismantling that needs to go on. We do need to deconstruct, we need to unbuild, as it were. And some of that's being done automatically for us at this point in time. Our job is to cooperate with that. Our job is to lean into that and to see it as an opportunity. and nobody's in the chat, so please do, you know, anything I'm saying that you're thinking, no, that's a load of rubbish, or yeah, here's my experience of that, please do add to the chat. Don't feel shy on that if you can find it, find the button. Another word that I think is really key in the systems space is this word hold. This is about how we relate to the space. It's about being able to really be the guardians of the space and hold it, embody it within us. And it's often about being willing to do things behind the scenes in that sense. Often coaching, supporting, holding up, really being the people that move behind the scenes in a system space, particularly when we're talking about trying to create some change. Plurality, again, I spoke earlier about this tendency to get into quite linear or isolationist or independent thinking, but actually in a systems leadership space, we have to be willing to truly get into a diversity of thinking, open ourselves to different perspectives, find ways of bringing in different contributors, go beyond the experts. You know, again, in organizational life, we tend to favor experts and then, in a sense, slavishly follow that expertise. But actually in the system space, we want different voices. We want people who don't know, because they'll be asking the questions, the obvious questions, the naive questions that start to shift our mindset and our thinking into new places. It does take time. It does require space, one of our other words that I've picked out. Space is about silence. It's about, are we prepared to create the silences that are needed, the space between the words, between the notes in the music, between the parts of the dance where you hold for a moment and then move again. Silence has the capacity to help build rhythm in a completely different way. And it actually allows us to hold ourselves in a place of receptivity, of openness, and to breathe. And systems leadership requires us to breathe. A couple of other words just to complete this, although, as I say, there are many others that are worth exploring. Emergence. It's a word that is not necessarily a very comfortable word for the space of organizations, because it feels a little too uncontrollable. It feels like, you know, we can't know where this is going to end up. And in a sense, that's the truth with systems, a systems mindset. It's not about knowing where we're going to, where the next move is literally going to take us, but it is ultimately about setting some direction. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But in this space of emergence, we're really recognizing that this is where two or more things will come together and they'll interact and they'll create something that's bigger than the sum of their individual parts. And a lot of the team development work that we get involved in is about that. It's about helping people to see that by interacting differently, by actually allowing things to unfold, new possibilities, new potential emerges that's beyond that original thinking. And then linking a little bit more into perhaps some of the more traditional change work people may be familiar with, this idea of magnets. But in this case, it's about finding those people who are able to be game changers, who are gear shifters, and also those projects that can act as beacons for new ways of thinking and that build courage for people in doing that. So hopefully we're starting to get some sense of this space of systems. And here I said we'd come back to this idea of interdependence and cause and effect. And the law of cause and effect is a really important one in working with systems leadership and systems thinking. And what the law of cause and effect helps us to understand is that, a bit like when we contemplate the butterfly effect, the butterfly flaps its wings and the effects of that can be felt for miles and miles onwards. So the energy that comes from that flapping of the butterfly wings actually reverberates out far further than you would imagine. And that butterfly effect, or that impact effect, is something that we don't think about enough as human beings, that being centered on ourselves, we have this ego that believes that we are bigger than the system within which we're operating. But actually every thought, every idea, every action that we take stimulates this law of cause and effect. And if we think about that in climate change terms, admittedly, we may not have had the same level of awareness that we have today, but our actions of 100 years ago, the Industrial Revolution, the mechanization, the exploitation of fossil fuels, has had an effect. The cause sits right back at an earlier state, but the effect is being lived today. So the reverberation has gone on far and wide. And Kate Raworth, who's a UK economist, brings us into sharp realization of this law when she reminds us that, still within the climate change space, that with all that we know today, scientifically, logically, practically, rationally, on every level, about climate change and our impact on that as a humanity, if in, say, 7 generations' time, they are looking back at this time, they would be well within their rights to say, we knew what was going on, and we, if we don't change our actions now, have caused the effect that they will be living in 7 generations' time. So when we think systems, we have to think in a much larger and bigger way. If we bring this then into a sort of, I guess, quasi-practical space from an organizational point of view, this is a McKinsey framework model that they put out in one of their articles. And it's one that we use quite a bit because it very quickly, visually, gives us a sense of what it means to move in more of a systems mentality, where we shift our thinking of organizations as machines and think about organizations as organisms. And even in those organizations where there seems to be perhaps more movement, more flexibility in the way the organogram works, matrix organizations, for example, what we still see fundamentally at the core of that is this more hierarchical, bureaucratic, silo-based ways of thinking and being. Whereas what we need to move towards is something that is much more interconnected, where we move away from boxes and lines and into more of the self-managing teams mentality and practice that Frederic Laloux introduced, but had been put in practice in a number of ways previously. And so exploring things like that and holacracy are important parts of thinking about how we set up activities in our organizations and how we bring people together. And that requires some of that dismantling of the traditional ways in which we tend to think about getting things done. A couple of examples of that, not going to go into the details of the case studies, but Zappos, if you want to do some research on them, very much committed to holacracy, not been an easy journey for them. They have fundamentally dismantled their organization and the way it works. And it's caused quite a lot of challenges for people in the organization as they have struggled to come to terms with that. In fact, some people have ended up having to leave the organization with the support of Zappos as they moved on to find other roles for them and help them to make that transition. And Buurtzorg in the health space, who are also working with the principles of self-managing teams in the medical, clinical nursing space, and being adopted by the UK in a number of hospitals as well as other organisations across Europe and beyond. So there are some examples where organisations are already starting to experiment with this more self-managing, enabling style of leadership, facilitative style of leadership, rather than that kind of control, top-down hierarchy. Now, early days, of course, but still heading in the right direction. One final thing to offer before we go into a review of what are the things that we need to be doing as systems leaders, and how do we start to move ourselves into that space? Uncertainty is something that is very present with us, as we know, and again, a bit like control, there's something about how we move into a new relationship with uncertainty and move ourselves into a space where we're prepared to recognize that uncertainty doesn't have to have that sense of feeling deeply unsafe. Now, that's not to say that uncertainty is safe, but it is to say that we can move into a relationship with uncertainty where it feels like it's safe because of how we are functioning within it, because of our attitude, our perspective, our mindset, and because of then the actions we take from that space. And so this framework here, the 4-box model, looks at degrees of safety and degrees of certainty. And there are situations, of course, where things are fundamentally uncertain and unsafe, and we feel unsafe within it. We're going to feel pretty vulnerable, to say the least. There are other situations where maybe there is more certainty in the environment, but actually it's the feelings that we have are still those of not feeling very safe. And the reasons that we may not feel very safe is that we're relying too heavily on the certainty, and yet there are other conditions that are going on. And this can lead to some quite dangerous and damaging responses. I'll come on and bring that to life a little bit in a minute. And then the space where we're very certain and very safe, able to operate in a very safe space. But actually what happens then is we get into that fixed mindset that we are experiencing in organizations quite a lot these days, where we control things, we block things, we don't look at our realities. So moving up into this top right-hand space where we can be much more in that learning mode and empowering, and where the energy is a good energy, even though it's an unstable energy, or it feels unstable, but we're dancing with it, we're moving with it in a different way. And I'm not sure that what I'm offering here is something everybody would agree with, and so I offer it with a slight tongue-in-cheek, but maybe just as a way of bringing things together. In our experience of COVID over these past months, it could be that we're feeling and experiencing all of 4 quadrants at any given point in time. But if we look to a degree at how organizations have approached, how countries have approached this, we can see that there are examples where some of the leaders have operated from a place of deep certainty in an environment which is actually fundamentally unsafe, and they've been creating danger and indeed a lot of damage. And we've seen that perhaps in Brazil and the USA. Not to say that New Zealand got everything right or is getting everything right. And of course, there's a lot of physiological and geographic factors that also affect New Zealand. But we are seeing, and there's lots of evidence now proving that quite a lot of those nations led by women, interestingly enough, have created a space where people feel in themselves a lot less fearful about the uncertainty and the unpredictability and the lack of safety that exists within COVID, and have brought them into perhaps a slightly better place. Perhaps the rest of the world has moved around between this bottom right-hand corner, but also perhaps to a degree the top left-hand, and we've perhaps flick-flacked between those. I just offer that as a way of helping to bring that framework to life. So what do we need to do? What if we as individuals are committed to leadership, systems leadership, what do we need to do, and how do we start to get into that space? And this brings us back to how do we learn to dance? How do we get into that space where we adopt those principles of dancing? And this is an extract from a paper that was written in the UK National Health space, where there was a recognition that the scale of the issues that we're facing and the degree of shape-shifting that is needed is something that can't be done in isolation, that it does require an interconnectedness. certainly trying to be a lone voice in the systems leadership space is a tricky ask. It definitely requires some collaboration, finding others of like mind and like spirit, and people who are prepared to come along with you on the journey and see this as a journey, one that requires some encouragement. And so we need to go beyond seeing ourselves as able to do things in an independent way and see them much more in an interdependent way. When it comes to this disrupting of the thinking, which I was encouraging us all to think about being part of this practice, we need to be prepared to think on a number of different levels. And again, this framework, I think, is quite helpful to help us think a little bit more holistically about change and about the way we engage with change and the projects and the activities that we set up in the space of change. So thinking, as we naturally do, around the physical and the intellectual activities, but also bringing in the psychological aspects of change, those things that have been built into our psyche individually and as groups and as whole organizations. Thinking about the social levels of change and the norms and the practices, what makes up our social and community infrastructure within an organization, and also the spiritual levels of change. What are the energies, the beliefs, the points of meaning that actually help people to engage with an organization? Again, we're seeing some shifts in that as younger people have grown up into a completely different space of accountability, responsibility, connection with their environment, and they're expecting organizations to be able to reflect that also. That's very much in that spiritual space, even if people wouldn't use that word for it. And this mapping here shows the degree to which this is actually a map of a number of projects that are taking place in the NHS at this point of time. And what it showed when people did the analysis was the heavy emphasis on the intellectual and physical space, and not enough, in most cases, emphasis on the psychological, spiritual, or social aspects of change. And so fairly quickly, we need to be able to get into a space where we are not allowing ourselves to be hooked into those traditional physical and mental spaces, but are prepared to move into those perhaps more energetic spaces in many ways, more subtle spaces. And here we can lean into the work in emotional intelligence, for example. We can move into the work that's been done around dialogic-based organizational development. There's a lot of work in that space, some of which I'm using here today, where we're actually getting into conversation. We're moving in a space where it's much more socialized change rather than imposed or linear change. But also the conscious leadership space, opening ourselves up to new resources, to a higher order of energy and interplay between ourselves and our environment, not just in the obvious sense, but in the subtle sense as well. And when we disrupt this thinking, we need to be thinking more about seeing our change activities, our transformational activities, as a bazaar. So not bizarre, but bazaar, as a bazaar that is has got much more texture, much more color, much more variety, much more hubbub going on than a cathedral, where it's built, in a very systematic, very linear fashion, and then becomes a very fixed structure. So we've got to be able to see things in a different way. Trying to bring that together and sort of summarize some of what I've been saying here about the qualities that we need, but then to bring that together into hopefully something that is useful on a very practical level. Well, if we want to think about ourselves as systems leaders, if we want to move into that space, of course, we've got to be able to see the larger system. So we've got to start shifting our perspective. We've got to open up into a new space. We have to be willing to deeply commit ourselves to the health of the whole, and that's got to exude from us. So we can't be partisan. Yes, we've got functions. Yes, we've got responsibilities, but we've got to really see ourselves as part of something whole rather than siloed in that sense. We've got to be able to shift perspective by getting into empathy with others. So empathy is a word that obviously we use fairly frequently, but a practice of that, really shifting our perspective and seeing through the eyes of people who are very different from us and very different from each other, and helping to bring that forward. Bringing in more generative conversations, more reflective conversations, and building in deep listening. It's something that, again, organizations struggle with. And again, being online has exacerbated that, because there's a lot more transactional activity going on. And that's creating its own psychosis, I have to say, from what I see of many organizations today. We've got to be able to take that breath, remember that holding, that space. We've got to be able to get into generative conversations, open up and go wherever they need to go. Moving from this reactive problem solving to co-creating. We've got a couple of tools that might help with that. Being clear that things can be done. It's not about, again, we tend to like a perfection, and as a perfectionist, sometimes I fall into this myself. But how do we move into that space where we have a good sense, an idea of what's needed, but we don't need to commit ourselves to the fully embedded activity? Yeah, thanks, Helen. Lots of virtual meetings equates to a very transactional exchange. You're seeing that too. And how do we move into that strength of not knowing? How do we actually allow ourselves to just not know? It's okay. And yet, back to that expert mentality, we tend to feel that that's what's going to be rewarded. We have to have the answers. We have to be able to move quickly here and now in this moment. But actually being prepared and willing to move into that not knowing for a period of time brings us into a different relationship with the question and the challenges. One of the tools or again, frameworks that one might use as a systems leader is moving into this idea of paradox and polarity management. Often when we think about problems in an organization, we tend into this either or thinking that I mentioned earlier, and that, sense that there's one or two or more right answers, and we get fixed into that and we want to then eliminate. But if we were to hold this more and or both and thinking, we then start to be able to see more paradox and interdependency. And what that enables us to do is shift our thinking rather than an either or into a new place of synthesis, a new solution. So when we get caught up in this, is this an organization that's task focused or people focused? Well, of course, it's not either or, it's both. We need to be able to get the tasks done. We need outcomes, we need outputs, but we need to be able to do that with people, through people, invite them into that space, enable. That requires a new point of synthesis, a new way of doing. That's how we bring the paradox to its higher level of expression, rather than constantly in this tug of war at the kind of adversarial level of expression. Another example, to what degree do we foster creativity and to what degree do we manage risk? And sometimes those can be seen as polar opposites in organizational life. Well, again, let's be creative and let's manage risk at a new level, which means investing in talent, in being able to trust our people, in recognizing their capabilities, and fostering an environment of trust and belief, as opposed to check and balance. Appreciative inquiry is something that, again, others may have come across, and this is another tool that can help us into that sort of generative dialogue space. Appreciative inquiry really has 4 core elements to it. Again, not going to do a teaching in it, just really signposting it for you as a tool that you might want to explore. But you'll see just through the language here that it's very much about thinking about the positives that are going on in the inquiry. Instead of going for that sort of critical mindset, it's going into, what do we want to achieve? How might we do that? Let's discover how we might do it. Where are we doing it already? Let's dream, let's open up the potential, and then let's work out how we're going to get there. And let's be willing to improvise and do that in a piece by piece way, rather than in a kind of fixed cathedral style way. And another tool, we're all very familiar with SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats. SOAR is a very appreciative tool that can be used, where we start to look at a situation and think about, what are the strengths that already exist? What are the opportunities that we've already identified? Where might we have some aspirations? And what are the results we're looking for? It's a shift in mindset, and it can be subtle but very powerful. Another, well, it's not really a tool, but it's a way of thinking about our role as systems leaders, is thinking about ourselves as edge walkers. Thinking about that very fine line, that what can feel like a very precarious line between the nursing of the old, of what's dying, of what needs to be let go of, what needs to die, and the midwifing, the birthing of the new. And as edge walkers, we're holding a fairly precarious, at times it will feel, place between those two. Because on the one hand, we have to encourage that dying, that death, that allowing things to be dismantled and to disappear, and their usefulness has been outlived. But at the same time, recognize that what's coming through is still quite fragile, it's still not yet established. And that requires us to step into a deep level of our own courage, but also our stillness. And as we see our world and put ourselves in the center of that world, not from the point of view of being the main thing that matters, but by finding that center point, and from there connecting with the outer space, we can start to move from a place of inner stillness and balance. And the tools and resources that we have in this space, of course, are things like mindfulness, meditation, reflection, going for walks, allowing ourselves to come into a place of stillness, silence. All of those, if we can embody those and live from that space, enable us to move within a system with a greater sense of flow, flexibility, and courage. So finding our inner stillness and balance is key. And as we sort of come to the end of this, and I hope this has been useful in just stimulating some of those thoughts, we're really coming to that place where we need to test our own inner agility and come to a place where we are developing that inner agility, that pausing in order to ultimately go faster into the space that we want to go into, and to shift our awareness and our thinking, not to an immediate tick box task, but to that giving ourselves some space, to be prepared to not know, ask the questions, radically reframe those questions, see the problem as in here, not just out there. So we shift our perspective and reframe. Set the direction, not the destination. So actually see ourselves as heading in a trajectory, a way of, an orientation rather than a fixed point, because actually being in the journey is where we start to move differently. Whereas if we're only ever focused on the destination, we miss the points in between. And be prepared to test all the time. Practice, practice, practice. Peter Senge tells us this all the time in his systems thinking work. Use the tools that you have available to you. Move into understanding more about dialogic organizations and what does that really look like. give us a call. We'll happily help you think about those things as well. So I invite you all to dance, to really embrace that idea, practice the mindset, the attitude of dancing, and wish you a very joyful journey as you embrace more of the systems leadership practices. Thanks for being with us today, and have a good Friday, everybody.